from the Salvation Army National Headquarters, this is the Fight for Good podcast.
Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Fight for Good podcast. I'm your host, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Foley. We're broadcasting from Alexandria, Virginia, Old Town, Virginia, in National Headquarters, sorta, kinda. We're all still scattered today to the four winds. And with me, as always, is my left and right-hand man, my left and right foots as well, because we're kicking indoors today. Mr. Jeff McDonald, our editorial director.
Hi,
kicking
Colonel.
It down.
We're kicking it as always. Thank you. Great to be with you on these enlightening and fun podcasts.
Contrary to our sister podcast team, I even forget the name of their podcast. That's because I'm a grumpy old man. Elizabeth, our producer, is with us as well. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hello, and you are so the opposite of grumpy old man.
Wait a minute. I've heard you
dapper.
I've heard you call him a curmudgeon before, I think.
Oh, yeah. Elizabeth, though, remind my failing memory, what was the name of that our sister podcast? I just can't remember.
I know, it's easy to forget. The Battle Line.
Oh,
yes.
That's right.
It's okay.
The Battle Line with those young whippersnappers. Anyways, we hope you're listening to the Battle Line because that's a lot of fun. Captains Matt and Jamie Satterley. I will, though, producer Elizabeth, I will remind you that they become old majors in a couple of months.
Say it ain't so. What?
Oh, yeah. We're going to have a little bit of fun at that. Well, with us today is a superstar on our staff. And he's back for a second go round because he was on our podcast here, Elizabeth. What about how many months ago
did we have January.
Our special guest?
Or late December. Yeah.
And our podcast went crazy, right?
I love Major Swain.
Yeah, yeah. And so we said we're sitting around a big table, like in a big room where we don't sit anymore, but an imaginary room. And we're like, okay, who are people that we can have talk, and whatever. And we know that this unsung hero in our staff that works so hard behind the scenes, Major Swain, he's our brainiac. He's our historian. He's our go-to utilitarian guy. And I am so thrilled today to welcome my friend and colleague, Major Jason Swain. Welcome to the Fight for Good podcast, sir.
It's great to be back again. I can't believe it's just been a couple of months. Wow. Time flies.
I told you we were going to make you famous, right? We were going to make you famous. But, what we find, and Elizabeth, you can speak into this, we find our history segments in the War Cry and on our social media feeds. Those usually get the most attention. Isn't that right?
It doesn't matter what it is. It's always number one. It's incredible.
Yeah, and I know you're working with Major Swain and with archives, and you're working with Salvation Factory. You're kind of finding all kinds of different new history. But what I have appreciated the last 3 years working with Major Swain is his historical brain that he has. He's got this capacity, but he's also very passionate about Salvation Army history because Major Swain, why are you passionate in the first place about history in general? Why is it important?
Well, it's interesting, and it always revolves around people. No matter what era you study, whatever, it's always about people. People did these things. We can talk about our fantastic machines that we have nowadays, but it's still people who invented them, and in years to come. They'll be talking about these 2021 years of the pandemic, and it'll revolve around people, the people who did something or didn't do something, and in 100 years or 200 years, it'll be history by that time. And in truth, yesterday was history. It's past. We can't repeat it. So. But it's always revolves around people, and the more you study history, the more you understand the modern world that we live in, decisions made just 5 years ago impact us today. But not even that, decisions that were made 1,000 years ago, even in a far off country, impact us today. And the other interesting thing is that it's never certain. Things could have gone a different way. So, it's true with the Salvation Army. It's true with the Civil War. It's true with the American Revolution. It's true of any wars we've been in. It's unpredictable. What we have is what happened. But if you go back, there's a sense of, well, what if this? What if that? What if this? What if that? Same with us today. A decision made today across the river in the capital might will impact us down the line. Maybe not today, but maybe in 10 years, 50 years, 1,000 years. You never know. And so it's those two aspects: is people and this little uncertainty you have. Now we're reading it as a certain fact, but back then they didn't see it that way.
Well, the thing that I've been since I arrived in DC a couple of years ago was to spend time not only with you but with my predecessor, Lieutenant Colonel Alan Satterley, who also had a great love for history. And I, as a Westerner, not familiar with the East Coast and Southern history and whatnot, but I was always intrigued by the Civil War and Revolutionary War. And both of you have been invaluable in just guiding me on some, interesting tidbits and different authors and things, people that you've read. And my wife and I have had the privilege of spending a little bit of time with you in some of the places around here. And so just to let you know, you're greatly appreciated by me personally, and also by our staff, because this is a historical time too that we're experiencing. Our war cry, our whole publication department, this is a little bit of history this past year with during the pandemic and meeting all our deadlines. And wouldn't you agree on that?
Oh yeah. I was listening to a BBC broadcast, and they were talking about some of the historical moments of this past year. And they were talking about pandemics of the past as well. And one of the things that they brought up that I never really considered was that working from home 20 years ago, 100 years ago, all the way back, was impossible. We didn't have internet. We didn't have computers. We didn't, you had to go to work. And so there was no working from home like we have known it this past year. It was an aspect I'd never thought about. That in years past you had to go to work, and so there were, people just did it, and there was no lockdowns, and because there was just no way it was ever going to happen. But we were able this year, because of the technology that I mentioned, because of internet, and because of laptops and iPads and whatever's, we could work from home effectively. And I think we in the publications department have definitely proved that. We have hit every deadline. We've hit every issue for a year now. And
which the challenge will be is we have, our administration is wanting everybody to come back to the building. But when you look at some business models and companies that are out there, especially companies that are filled with millennials, some of those office spaces are never going to be occupied again. They're continuing this same model that has been developed.
There was a great article in, I believe it was USA Today, but it may have been another publication that was talking about small business offices that have decided that they don't need the expense of the quote unquote office anymore. And so because of the, being able to work from home, and that they are going to meet, if they have to meet at all in person, they're just going to call an employee meeting at a restaurant or something when we get to that point, because they could talk through the internet, have their business meetings. They can do their work. It's all online anyway. And so they were highlighting these 5 or 6 companies who are basically going to save hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, by not having an office space.
Well, that's a podcast for another day, and it's not a conversation any of us in this podcast today are at I mean, we can have our opinions about it, but it is what it is. But we brought you here today because we have a few questions that we want to ask you, and I'm gonna, Jeff, you've been over there quietly taking a nap while Major Swain and I have been chatting. See, that's what this, folks, is what I have to work with. I just can't believe it. But Jeff, I was wondering if you wanted to jump into the fray here and ask Major Swain a couple things.
Thank you, Colonel. Appreciate that. Yeah, there's so much we can delve into. Really appreciate Major Swain's historical highlights column that's been running in the War Cry, where he's spotlighting different aspects of Salvation Army history. And of course, that's available at thewarcry.org. I'm always impressed how the Salvation Army history and Salvationists enjoy their own history and are very self-examining. And I think that's one reason why the Army continues in its mission and perpetuates its mission well, because the Army is so self-conscious of its history, its roots, and what it means and what it might mean for the future. So with that, Major Swain, I know that you have expertise in many fields in history. I do have a couple of quotes for you that kind of resonate with what you were saying. One says, "The only normal people are the ones you don't know very well." The other is, "The study of history is a powerful antidote to contemporary arrogance." So one of the questions I would ask offhand is, who are some of your favorite characters in Salvation Army history? And also, what lessons from history do you think will help the Army move into the modern era, into this era? That's
let me do the second one first. The Salvation Army is always, I want to say, reinventing itself. Not in the doctrinal views or anything. Our doctrines have never changed for 150 some odd years. But we've changed tactics, we've changed styles, we've changed publications. All these things have we changed. Seems like every 20 or 30 years we kind of go through a change. So I think with the advent of social media, which we have gotten on, and we're getting better at every year, it seems like we're getting better. The advent of more media coverage, traditional media coverage. The thing that we're going to have to look at really soon, not now, but within the next decade, is do our print media do we still need the print media? For a long time, I thought we were kind of going away from it totally, and so many newspapers, magazines, publications went away as far as a physical. But it's interesting because the ebook / print, non-print media has plateaued for the past 3 years. It's not risen and it's not decreased. It's just kind of flatlined. So, and there is a movement, of course, of speaking of publications, people want books. People want to hold a book and read a book. There's something about a book. So at least for the time being, I think we're good there. Internationally, what's going to change is the decrease of the English-speaking world, Britain, America, Australia, New Zealand, the British English-speaking world, as far as membership and number of officers, and the increase of Asian and African churches, Salvation Armies especially. When you have a country that like Kenya, that splits into 2 different territories. Kenya is a small portion of the size of the United States, and yet they have cores of thousands of people. And I'm thinking a core with 1,000 people, not cores of 1,000 people. A church core 1,000 people, and there's multis of them. I even heard they're talking about splitting it again. So that's the challenge. The challenge will be to kind of redefine where we are, in the world. Now, some of my favorites. Oh gosh, there's so many interesting characters, so many interesting pioneers. But I have found a thread in some research that I've been doing. They all have a certain thread in that they were all passionate about the Army, and they were also filled with energy. I mean, boundless energy. They would get up early in the morning and go all day, and then attend an all-night prayer meeting, 12, 1, 2 in the morning, and then do it again, day after day after day after day. They all, or at least not all, but a good portion of these men and women all had this, and you read about it, they kept saying their drive and their energy, and they had a passion for doing what they were doing. And you've got folks like Railton, George Scott Railton, who was our first commissioner here in the United States, but he joined the Christian mission, as it was called back then, as William Booth's secretary, and he becomes indispensable. He's the top three of leadership, as William Booth, Bramwell Booth, and George Scott Railton. That's the top three. And he becomes indispensable. He gets sent to America, and he does some wild and crazy things over here. But then he continues to do that. He goes back to England. He still does wild and crazy things. He gets sent to Germany, and he pioneers the work in Germany, and then he comes back. And it's just back and forth he goes, and he's all over the world doing things. And, his end kind of comes a little ingloriously, but he's still an active officer, and he is in Germany, and he's going to Switzerland, and he stops in Germany for a layover, we would call a layover, and he leaves his bags at the train station with the porter. He goes to visit the officer couple that is in Germany and Cologne, and he has tea with them, and he stays with them for a while. And then they realize he stayed a little bit too long, so he rushes back to the train station, grabs his bags from the porter, and runs up the stairs, and literally jumps on the train as it's leaving the station, gets to his seat, collapses in a heap, and dies. Has a heart attack and dies right there in Germany. But he was in his 60s, late 60s, and doing that kind of thing. But that was kind of energy, kind of person he was. The first Salvationists that came to America, the Shirley family, were all amazing people. They came in waves, but Eliza, who I've come to really respect, she was 15 years old when she was commissioned a lieutenant in the Salvation Army. She was such a fervent, Bible-believing Christian that she was impressed General Booth, and he commissioned her and sent her to the north of England as an assistant. She was made a lieutenant a few weeks later. And she did some amazing work up there. And then her parents decided for economic reasons to move to America. And she just, even though she was far away from them, she didn't want to be that far away from them. And so she wrote and said, "Can I go?" And there was kind of a back and forth of, "You shouldn't really go. You're committed to the Salvation Army now." And finally, they kind of relent, and then they said, "Well, if you're there, you might as well start something along the lines of the Salvation Army." And that's where we get the beginnings, the early beginnings here in this country.
Yeah. So, it reminds me of the phrase that history would have been different if Cleopatra's nose had been a little shorter. But, there's a sense, I can't help but think of the sovereignty of God in history and how that is evident in the Salvation Army's history. I don't know if you find that in your studies, but what is absorbing your historical interest at present?
Well, I'm working on a little study of those early days of the Salvation Army here in America. That's why I brought up the Shirleys. Those first dozen years or so, maybe 20 years, were just interesting in all that happens, all that goes on. It's fascinating because so much happened so quickly. I mean, you've got the Shirleys here in 1879, and they've got one little, what they have their trials and tribulations, but they finally get kind of settled, and then they're doing so well, they open a second location, so a second corps, and that's going so well that, and they're sending reports back to London, and finally, it's, the Salvation Army decides, okay, we need to officially go, and so officially we show up in 1880, but there's already people here, our 2 corps in Philadelphia, and it's a hard couple of years. Corps were being opened, but there was no fundraising base. There was no, the Salvation Army. What's that? Who are you? And it all kind of came to a head. And then Railton does something strange. He goes off and says, "I'm going to St. Louis." It'd be like the general, saying, "I alone am going to the moon." And I will send you my directives from the moon. That's as strange as I could get it, because we're going to move international headquarters to Fiji. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And this Railton never did anything that made sense, but he goes by himself and off to St. Louis, 950 miles away from his base here. It's really just New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia. It's just that corridor where the corps are right now. And then he leaves, a new person comes in, and then we get a misunderstanding of epic proportions, and then we get a little bit of a rebellion, which is the main point of the book that I am working on. And then that kind of dies out, and then we kind of have a reconciliation. But by that time, the Army is all the way out. If you remember, I said we're just kind of at the beginning, we're just in this Philadelphia, New York corridor. Well, by that time in 1889, we're all the way out into Kansas, Missouri, Minnesota, down into the South, up all the way up to Maine, Canada. The United States kind of starts in Canada, and Canada becomes its own thing. We're in Michigan, we're in all parts of the South, Atlanta, and all the way out west. So we're and then in California, they start off, out of the air, and so they're working their way west, and they kind of do meet eventually. But back then, you got to remember that the middle part of the country past Kansas was still territories. It wasn't a state. Most of those were not states yet. They were just territories, and they would become states in time. But and the railroads didn't even go all the way out there yet, necessarily.
Sounds like a lot of grit and determination. And,
yeah. Well, they did strange. Yeah, they did strange things too. They would. Officers back then did not necessarily go to training school. Training schools did not come into the training schools as we know them didn't really come into play until the late 1890s. Back then, they had divisional training garrisons, they were called, and so maybe in your divisional town, you would have a corps that would accept cadets, and you would and training was back then was only about 3 to 6 months, and then you were commissioned and off you were sent. And so a lot of times, what they would do is they would basically take a lieutenant down to the train station with his bags packed, and they would say, okay. Get off at the next station, and that's your new command. Go, and that's it. That was it. Like, so you could almost track corps opening by if you knew where the train stations were. You could okay, you leave Columbus, Ohio. What's the next station? What's the next stop? Is there a corps there? No. Okay, you jump off, and and then maybe 6 months later, you'd get your flag. My favorite story, I may have mentioned this last time, but I'm going to tell it to you again, is of a big divisional meeting, and divisional commander calls a lieutenant up on stage, and he says, Lieutenant, I want you to go to such and so city and start the Salvation Army there. And I got you a flag. And, here's the flag. And everybody claps. And the lieutenant leans in and says, sir, what am I supposed to do? Like, what's my budget? And my favorite division commander says, well, I got you a flag. And go. And and that, it was so funny. I when I taught Salvation Army history at the training college in the South, I told that story, and one of my cadets thought it was false, like it was a false story. And then commissioning happened, and that is almost word for word what happened at commissioning just 3 years ago. Territorial commander commissioned a lieutenant to a new opening, and he had a flag for me, and here's your flag. And he turned around to leave the stage, and he looked right at me, and I just had a big old smile on my face, like, told you so. It happens. It still happens today. Those are kind of the fun things that happened back then, and I'm working on that. And it's nearing its completion. So
okay, so really in the early days. So were most of these early pioneers converts, and were they related to the Great Awakening that took place in America?
Yeah, this here in America, there were officers who came from England, but the farther you get from 1880 away, the less there are. There are still some that come, but for the most part, you're making converts, you're attracting people, and like I said, if they have passion and zeal and they have some ability that you recognize, they would go to these, as I said, these divisional training garrisons for 6 months, or 3 months, or 6 months, segregated by sex. Females went to one, males went to another, and you would learn the trade of being an officer, and then they would be sent out. And a lot of times it was, you maybe 6 months at a be an assistant to kind of learn a little bit more, and then they would send you out, maybe somewhere you had never been, which is still true today. Colonel Foley talks about, he's from the Western Territory out in California, and all of a sudden you get an appointment to Virginia. I mean, culture shock alone, but, there's just such a different vibe of life here.
But the peanuts are really good here.
But the peanuts are really It's true.
I will admit, though, the one thing that I have not gotten used to is the driving here in Virginia. I just saw somebody this morning on her way to work did a 2-lane U-turn right in front of us, just like, and I started to say something, and my wife always is like, "Don't say anything. You can't change it. Just keep driving."
Yeah, I followed a person from a different state here the other day, and they were all over the place. And I thought, where did you learn to drive? It's not that way.
It's true. It should be a big test.
Yeah.
Well, Major, there's a lot of different things that we could talk to you about, and we have just a couple of more questions that we want to ask you, and specifically, if we can speak to them. The first one would be, what is it that you can share with us about the creation and the evolution of ranks and uniforms in the Salvation Army?
Of course, the Salvation Army used to be called, was the Christian Mission, and they had kind of a basic uniform that we want to that it was mainly for the what they would call the evangelists, or the leaders of their corps, which weren't called corps, their mission stations. And they kind of had the women, you wear this, and men, you wear this. So it was kind of the standard. And then, when we became the Salvation Army, it was like, well, we need a uniform. So there kind of became and if you look at old pictures, there is a bewildering display of uniforms. They're wearing everything and anything. It's anything military. Like they went to the Army supply store or a rag shop, and they found something, hats, helmets and derbies and all kind of, my favorite one was there was a corps in New York, I believe. They all wore firemen's hats they got somewhere, like helmets, like these, and the shield in front had the Salvation Army on it. So that had to become recognized early on, and we kind of got to this dark blue was kind of an easy cloth that was cheap to make, and that was the standard. Ranks were another whole thing. They came in kind of spontaneously, but she's like, okay, what are we going to call our officers? Well, at the beginning there was really only 3 ranks at the very beginning. William Booth was the general, easy enough. There was only going to be one, and he was it. We're going to call our mission stations, which are now going to be called corps. We will call them captains, and if they have an assistant, they are lieutenants. So that was the earliest ones. That's from 1878, and those are still ranks today, the first and second. And then they said, well, we need to call our staff officer something, those in charge of divisions. And so then they created the rank of major. And then it gets kind of a little discombobulated. There's a bewildering array of ranks that happen over the years. They come, they go, the rank chart expands, it decreases, it expands, it decreases. And you have everything from staff captain, which was someone who was on the staff but wasn't a major and a staff captain. You have adjutants and ensigns and senior majors and field majors and commandants, and marshal was a rank for a while, and he just all these different ranks, commander, and they didn't have insignia for all those, right? So they started experimenting with colors. So you could see old pictures. It's kind of hard to tell in black and white pictures, but you can kind of get a sense. There were some greens, there were some purples, reds, yellows, and so it's kind of hard sometimes when you see these old pictures. You're saying, well, why is his star not on his epaulet? Why is it up on his neck? On because they had high collar uniforms, up on his collar. That makes him a lieutenant. No. If it's up on the collar and it's on the front of his S, that makes him an adjutant. You just had to know. You just kind of had to know. Luckily, like I said, we've experimented with different things. We've got down to the basics. These days, you've got lieutenants and captains, your junior ranks, your majors, your senior ranks. And then you've got your lieutenant colonels, and the commissioners, who are the highest ranking folks in the Army world. They lead territories and do other high level jobs, and of course the general himself. But that all kind of, like I said, they've expanded, they've collapsed, and if you don't know, if you have an old picture of a family member and you're not sure why their stars are up here or down there, just ask somebody, and they might be able to tell you why the way it looked like it did.
We'll have them ask you, Major Swain.
Well, yeah, and I got called on one time, questioned because on a high collar uniform, with the collar on here, when you're a major, your major's crest is up on your collar. So if you look at it, from the side, it's an S, and then your major's rank is on the left side, and so there's nothing on your epaulet at all. So it's just blank. And so people were questioning how come my epaulet was blank, and I said it's not blank. I'm a major. It's up here. And same with if you're a lieutenant colonel, it's the same way. Like your crest rank is up here on the collar, but the only thing is differentiates, which is still true on the modern uniforms, is you have this little silver piping around your epaulet. So it's subtle, and the changes that happen. And some people don't know that because it's changed. The differences between lieutenant colonel and colonel are on the modern uniforms is one item, and that's the S's on our collars. Full colonels have a silver piping around them. That's the only difference.
The difference in duties between a lieutenant colonel and colonel are completely different.
I'm talking uniforms. And the only other difference you would be able to tell is on the caps, their hats, which we rarely wear anymore. But colonels have a different cap design. Their hat band, or we would call them bonnet band, has a white highlight on it. which is hard to tell because we don't wear them anymore.
I guess one of the innovations lately has been the assignment of ranks to female officers. Is that right? In married
Well,
couples?
That's a great history question because, if you had Captain and Mrs. Smith, or, she was Mrs. Captain Smith, she still wore the rank. She was still a captain, but it was just in my lifetime that they started, you were captains, Joe and Jane Smith. And if anything ever happened to Captain Joe, Captain Jane would move on. And there's only, and that's, they had a real conundrum with that when it got up to the higher ranks, not the commissioners, but with the general, because up until that time, the general's wife was always Mrs. General such and so, and she wore the gold like everyone else. Well, they said no, she's got to have her own rank. And so they became commissioners. So now when we speak of the general, we say General Bryan and Commissioner Rosalie Peddle. So she has a rank. She's a commissioner. And so she wears her commissioner's rank and he wears his general's rank.
Yeah. It's amazing. The exponential growth of the Army in its early stages, not only in America, but around the world. It's just incredible. So the Army's now in 132 countries, just opened to Bulgaria. It's a remarkable international family. But in the U.S. now, there are 4 territories and have been. How did these territories get differentiated, formed?
Yeah, in the early days, there was just one. Of course, when you only have 12 corps, it's easy to have just one territory. It was just the United States territory for many years, 20 plus years. And then in the 1890s, there was kind of this realization of how really big America is, or the United States is. By that time, the California Salvation Army was part of the United States territory. We were ranging everywhere in between, and so there was some talk that we need to split this thing up. This thing was a little too bulky. We need to split it up. Well, it took a little bit more time, and it didn't happen until the 19-teens. And the first division is what they did is they left headquarters in New York, and they said there's now going to be a Western Department, and that's what they called it, Western Department. And they made the headquarters in Chicago, so there's really a Western Department and an Eastern Department. And they created created a rank called Lieutenant Commissioners. So you had the National Commander, who at the time was Evangeline Booth, and you had these 2 Lieutenant Commissioners. One was in Chicago, one was in New York. So that's the beginning. And then just a few years later, they said, no, that's not good enough. So we're going to create the Western Territory, the Central Territory, and the Eastern Territory, and New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. And that worked pretty good for a while, but it still wasn't enough. And so in the early 1920s, before the Depression, they looked at the map and said, okay, the Western Territory is fine like it is. Let's take half of the Eastern and half of the Central and call it the Southern Territory. And they drew the line, roughly the old Confederacy, roughly. And that was the South. The East is the East, the Central is the Central, and it was New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and Atlanta. Now it was a kind of interesting. They actually cities competed for where territorial headquarters was going to be, because it was not sure. There wasn't a huge city. Atlanta today is a lot different than it was in 1927. So you had Nashville, Dallas, Birmingham, Atlanta, and Charlotte, North Carolina, all were about the same size cities. And so territorial headquarters could have been in any of those places. But somebody got word, and this was in the 20s. Now think about this. Somebody got word in the 20s that Atlanta was thinking about building an airport.
Yeah.
And no one else was even talking about this. And so they built an airport, and that was the selling point. And so territory headquarters moved to Atlanta in 1927. And it hasn't changed much. The borders, we talked about this in a war cry couple months back. The borders haven't changed hardly at all, which is it's fascinating to think about in 100 years, almost 100 years, that, the borders are the borders. There's been some adjustments. For a time, El Paso, Texas, which is way out on the western panhandle of Texas, was part of the Western Territory, and that was reabsorbed back into the Southern Territory a few years ago. Parts of Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky, were part of the Eastern Territory, and that is now all back in the South, except for 10 counties. 10 counties down the center of Kentucky are part of the Eastern Territory. Little bits and pieces here and there get, taken over because this is closer to a core this way or that way. But those are now totally run not by lieutenant commissioners. Lieutenant commissioners were done away with after World War II. They're full commissioners, all four of them. And then when that was created in the 1920s, the first commissioners conference was held, which was the territorial commanders and the chief secretaries of all the territories got together at national headquarters with the national commander, and they would coordinate between themselves. Still going on today. We still host those when possible here at national headquarters. And of course, there's still a national headquarters. There's always been a national headquarters. Its role has changed and morphed over the years, but there's always been a national commander. We kind of lucked out in that Evangeline held on to her post for as long as she did, 30 years. So we could have had, 15 or 20 different national commanders, but we just had one for 30 years. So that helps in memorizing who they are.
Yeah, but she was so dynamic and unusual. Yes.
Yeah, she
Evangeline.
was. She had her faults, as they all did, but she and she had all the I don't say faults, but she was much like her father. She was her father's favorite, and so much like him in her autocratic style. And she had different faces of life. She had her office face, which was pretty serious, down to business. She had her public persona, which was flamboyant and a wonderful speaker, and then she kind of had her private side as well when she went on vacation and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's so fascinating, all that, all the information you have and know about. Are there some fun facts you can share with us about?
Oh, there's tons of them.
Personalities or history?
Give us three.
Oh gosh, put me on the spot.
Give
me
one.
3 fun
Yeah,
facts.
that's tough. Sorry.
Well, let's see. We built our own building, headquarters building in the 1890s. We built it. It's on 14th Street, New York. That building served as national headquarters, territorial headquarters, until the 30s, when it was demolished and a new one was built. That building is still there. You can go to New York, 14th Street, New York, and find the Salvation Army building. It's still there, still used. It's the New York Temple Corps, I believe it is. Yeah, because they used to have Thursday nights at the Temple, which was a regular meeting. Down in Atlanta, this is another fun fact. Down in Atlanta, the local radio station WSJ back in the 20s and 30s used to broadcast on Sunday nights from the training college. The old training college chapel. They would bring in their mics and everything, and they would broadcast the service on Sunday nights once a month. And so the principal at the time was a guy by the name of Sidney Cox. And Sidney Cox is a famous Salvation Army songwriter. And so he would write various pieces for these broadcasts. And some of his most famous works were rehearsed by the training college staff and cadets, and they would get up and sing it, literally on the radio. And then the radio guys would pack up and off they would go, and they would do it a month later. They did that they did it up to World War II. They would broadcast from the training school. I always thought that was kind of a cool little fun fact. And I think Jeff mentioned we're in work at Bulgaria now, which is a fun country 132 on our roster of places. And if you don't know where Bulgaria is, it's down near Turkey, north of Greece, big country. I don't think we've ever. I looked to see. I don't think we've ever been at work in that country, because at the time, when we were expanding and doing our things in Europe, Bulgaria was part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and so would not have been open to us to work there. So it's kind of fun that there's a great photo of somebody did here at National Headquarters many years ago when we hit 100. And I have that poster somewhere. It's this with all the flags of the 100 countries, and thinking in the 20 some odd years since we've added 32, and there's still a lot more to go. I believe there's 214 countries in the world, so we have a lot. And it's kind of funny, like you check them off and you say, well, what's left? And then you realize there are a lot of places that we're not, like in Africa and the Middle East, that we're not at all. So you're like, okay.
Tell our listeners, in conclusion, what you're working on. You kind of mentioned it earlier.
Mm-hmm.
You just kind of subtly dropped it in there. It's something you're currently working on.
I'm finishing up. I did mention finishing up a book about the Moore Rebellion and the early days of the Army in America. It goes roughly through 1913. And that date is just kind of when the end of these copycat Salvation Armies happened. In our early days, the people tried to copy us, and so they would start their own little Salvation Army type thing, and they didn't really last as long as they'd hoped, I guess. But it chronicles the early days of the Army in New York, Philadelphia. It goes on to talk about Thomas More and his little rebellion, and then what happens to that. And then we talk about the reconciliation that happens, and then the rebuilding of the Salvation Army as just one unit throughout the next 20 years. And then the resignation of Ballington Booth, our national commander at the time, and his wife, what they do with their lives after that. And then the next two national commanders, the Frederick and Emma Booth Tucker, and then Evangeline, who kind of ends the story because in 1913 all of the legal injunctions happen, and all these copycats basically go away. It's been a fun little project. The joy about it has been that I work here at National Headquarters, and our archives is just literally 2 floors down, and I've spent a lot of time down there, a lot of afternoons, just combing through files and books and telegrams and old war cries. And I got war cry dust all over me. If I ever, get sick, I'm going to blame 120-year-old war cries. But if you find the most interesting, fascinating things about the Salvation Army of America, which is a whole separate thing, the American Salvation Army, which was a whole other different another whole different group. So you get all these groups together, and you're like, I can't keep them straight, and you got to remember who is who and who's what. But the best part of the whole thing was that in 1889, we had this the group that rebelled early on return in this dramatic fashion in this big meeting up in Saratoga, New York, and they have this big emotional meeting, and everybody speaks, and that's of anybody, and they walk out arm in arm, singing at the top of their lungs, just like Salvationists would do back in the day. And only a very small group are disaffected by this reconciliation, and they go on and do something else. So you actually have 2 or 3 different groups who kind of compete, and that all kind of, it ends the first ending happens in 1889. The second ending happens in 1903 or 4. And then the last ending happens in 1913. So it's going to be a fun read. Definitely a definite read for anybody interested in Salvation Army history. Definite read for any new Salvationist in America, because that's our history. That's who we are. That's the reasons why we do the things we do in America. And part of that is because of all this stuff that happened 120, 140 years ago.
Well, you've gifted Jeff and I the opportunity to look at some of your first drafts, and I can say to our listeners, you'll be wanting to get your copy of this book because it's an easy read, it's a fun read, it's an interesting read, and I'm really proud of the work that you're doing. I see you're very passionate about it, and then also you're still kind of doing what I'm asking you to do at times because we have other minutia in our department that has to happen. And so, Major, on behalf of the Fight for Good podcast, we thank you for coming back on, and we thank you for all the hard work that you're doing behind the scenes. And we hope that our listeners will give your articles a little bit of attention. We have you in every episode or every issue of the War Cry, and you can read Major Swain's work at the warcry.org. And I've also tasked you making sure you have stuff lined out for the rest of the year, and I think you already have done that.
Yeah, it's been hard to not write about what I'm writing about, if that makes sense. I'm writing about this whole early history here in America, but I've got to also think about the articles that I write for the War Cry, which is highlights in history. So I have to find interesting things that don't relate to what I'm writing about, so I don't give up any.
Well, I understand that completely because I wrote on Sabbath, but I need to write on workaholism. The benefits of it. It's hard to juggle the balls, but we really appreciate you joining us today. And so we encourage our listeners again to consider reading the works. And Elizabeth, I know you would like to hear comments. We like the comments on our social media feeds about some of our historical things.
I love comments. Those are great. Keep them coming.
Keep them coming. And then I know, Jeff, sometimes you take those comments and you put them in print.
We do. We share them with our readers. And Major Swain has set a high precedent for us to continue covering Salvation Army history, which is a fascinating topic in and of itself and almost inexhaustible.
Since we've recorded this podcast, Major Swain is under farewell orders and will become the Corps officer in Ashland, Kentucky. We're grateful to Major Swain for all that he has done in our publications department here at National Headquarters these past 3 years, and we wish him all the best and Godspeed in his new appointment. Be looking for a book that will be published this summer by Major Swain that will be coming to you via Crest Books and ChristianBooks.com. Well, that's going to end this episode of the Fight for Good podcast. Be sure to subscribe to Fight for Good wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to follow the War Cry and Peer Magazine on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Until next time, this has been the Fight for Good podcast. Bye for now.
Subscribe to Fight for Good wherever you listen to podcasts.